The first thing Grace noticed was the silence. A deep, heavy silence that presses down on you. The kind that only comes when a thick blanket of snow has swallowed every sound in the world. For a moment, she just lay there, listening. The only sound was the soft, fading crackle of embers in the hearth. 3 years. 3 years since the fire, and every morning she still reached for Robert's side of the bed before her eyes were even open. An old habit that died harder than a winter oak. She swung her legs out, her bare feet pulling back from the icy floorboards. Outside, the world was painted in the soft colors of a bruise, lavender and pale gold spilling over the snow-covered peaks. Grace dressed quickly, pulling on the practical layers of a woman who depended on no one but herself. Wool, canvas, flannel, and leather. Her armor against the cold. The cabin was small, just one room. Robert had built it with his own hands when they first staked their claim on this piece of land, right beside the lake. A bed, a table, two chairs. In a little trunk at the foot of her bed were the few things she'd managed to pull from the flames. And on the mantelpiece above the cold fireplace sat a little wooden doll. Its edges were charred black, its painted smile melted away. It was all that was left of Lucy. Grace coaxed the fire back to life, feeding it pine logs that hissed and filled the small space with a sharp, clean scent. As the coffee began to brew, her eyes scanned the wall where her herbs hung in neat, drying bundles. Yarrow for deep cuts, willow bark to break a fever, and dozens more. She'd learned them all from an old medicine woman, long gone now. Down in Echo Ridge, some folks whispered she was a witch, but the desperate ones, the ones with a sick child or husband with a mangled hand, they still made the long journey to her door. They called her the forest fairy, but never ever to her face. She took her coffee out onto the porch, the steam rising in a cloud around her face. She looked out at her world. The lake was a sheet of dark, frozen glass, catching the first weak rays of morning sun. Beyond it, the pine forest rose like a wall, and then the mountains, ancient and silent. The trap lines. She had to check the trap lines. A storm was coming. She could smell it in the air, a sharp metallic tang. She could see it in the heavy, bruised-looking clouds piling up on the horizon. If she didn't get to her traps now, they'd be buried until the spring thaw, lost under feet of snow. Grace strapped her snowshoes to her boots and slung her rifle over her back. As she started toward the tree line, she glanced at the weathered sign Robert had nailed to a pine tree years ago. Winter's property, no trespassing. Someone from town had scrawled a single word underneath it in crude, angry letters. Witch. She left it there. A reminder. A reminder of why she preferred the quiet company of the trees over the loud company of men. Lately, Victor Hammond's men had been getting more aggressive. 3 times in the last month, they'd ridden up to her cabin, each time with a bigger offer for her land. Each time, she'd sent them packing. This land wasn't for sale. Not to the Echo Ridge Timber Company, not to anyone. The scream of their saws already echoed through the valley day and night, devouring the forest one piece at a time. This land was sacred. This was where Lucy had picked wildflowers. This was where Robert had taught her to fish. This was where their laughter still echoed in her memory, tangled up with the whisper of the pines. She checked her revolver, tucked a hunting knife into her belt, and walked into the forest. The snow was a perfect, untouched canvas, marked only by the delicate tracks of deer and fox. She followed the familiar path, marked by blazes Robert had cut into the tree trunks years ago. The forest was like a great cathedral, silent and still. Here, she wasn't the strange widow. She wasn't the witch. She was just Grace. Her first trap line held 2 rabbits, their fur thick and white for the winter. The second held a fox, its coat so fiery red it looked like it was burning against the snow. Grace worked with a quiet efficiency. For each animal, she whispered a word of thanks, a promise to waste nothing. It was what her father had taught her. As she reset the last trap, the wind changed. It brought with it that metallic smell again, stronger this time. The storm was coming in fast, faster than she'd thought. The dark clouds had completely swallowed the sun, plunging the world into a false twilight. She had to get home. And that's when she heard it. A scream. A human scream, raw with pain and terror. It was followed by a sound that made the blood in her veins run cold. The chorus of wolves on a hunt. Grace froze. She listened, her head cocked. The sound came again, closer this time. Without a second thought, she pulled her rifle from her back and started moving toward the sound, her snowshoes sinking into the deep drifts. She crested a small hill and looked down into the clearing below. And she saw him. A man was collapsed in the snow, a dark crimson stain spreading out from under him. His horse lay dead nearby, its insides steaming in the frigid air. And circling them both, moving like gray smoke, were four timber wolves. They were closing in. The man was trying to drag himself toward a fallen log, one of his legs bent at an unnatural angle. He was still clutching a revolver, but it looked like he was out of shots. The biggest wolf, the alpha, lunged forward. Grace didn't hesitate. She raised her rifle and fired two shots into the air. The sound cracked through the silent forest like a whip. The wolves scattered, melting back toward the tree line. But they didn't leave. They stood there watching, their eyes glowing with a hungry intelligence. They wouldn't stay gone for long. Grace slid down the snowy bank into the clearing, her rifle still ready. She never took her eyes off the wolves. "Don't move," she called out to the man. "You'll only bleed faster." Up close, she could see how bad it was. His left thigh was torn wide open, all the way to the bone. Blood pulsed from a severed artery with every beat of his heart. Without help, he had minutes, maybe less. "Leave me," the man rasped, his lips cracked and blue. His face was pale under a week's worth of stubble, his eyes bright with fever and pain. "Not worth it. They'll get us both." Grace ignored him. She dropped to her knees in the blood-soaked snow and went to work. She ripped off her wool scarf, folded it into a thick pad, and pressed it hard against the wound. Her hands moved with a practiced confidence. She grabbed a broken branch, using it as a winch to tighten a tourniquet she fashioned from a strip of her own shirt. The man screamed once, a sharp, choked-off sound, and then went silent. His breath was coming in shallow little gasps. His eyelids began to flutter. "Stay awake," Grace commanded, her voice sharp as broken glass. "What's your name?" "Ethan," he whispered. "Ethan Wolf. An ironic name for a man about to be eaten by wolves." "I'm Grace Winters," she said. "I'm going to get you to my cabin, but you have to help me. Stay conscious." One of the wolves let out a long, mournful howl. It sent a shiver down her spine. They were getting bolder, sensing the man's weakness. "My sledge is just over that rise," she said, looking at his face. He was handsome, in a rugged sort of way, with strong features and eyes the color of a summer storm. "I need to drag you there. This is going to hurt." "Always does," he managed to say, trying for a grim smile that turned into a grimace of pain. Grace grabbed him under his arms and started to pull. He bit back another scream as his mangled leg dragged through the snow. He was heavy, all solid muscle, but Grace had hauled deer carcasses heavier than this. This was just a piece of meat that happened to talk back. The wolves followed them, keeping a cautious distance. They were patient. They knew time was on their side. As she was heaving Ethan toward her sledge, his saddlebag fell open, spilling its contents onto the snow. She quickly scooped up what she could, a few strips of jerky, some ammunition, a flint and steel. Then she saw it, a lawman's badge, broken nearly in half, and beside it, a folded newspaper clipping about a forest fire. And tucked inside the clipping was a photograph of a young woman who looked almost exactly like her. Grace's breath caught in her throat. The newspaper was dated 3 years ago, the same year her own cabin had burned, the same year Robert and Lucy had died. Her hands trembled as she shoved the items into her own pocket. Questions burned through her mind like wildfire. Who was this man? Why was he carrying a picture of a woman who could have been her twin? And what did it have to in with the fire that had destroyed her life? There was no time to think about it now. The wolves were getting closer, drawn in by the thick trail of blood they were leaving in the snow. She managed to get Ethan onto the sledge and tied him down with a rope. His face was ashen, his consciousness flickering like a dying candle. "Hold on," she murmured, not even sure if he could hear her. The journey back to the cabin was a living nightmare. The storm hit with full force, a swirling blizzard of white that cut visibility down to just a few feet. The wolves shadowed them the whole way. Gray ghosts in the storm, Twice, the Alpha darted in so close that Grace had to fire a warning shot to drive it back. By the time she saw the dark shape of her cabin through the swirling snow, she was on the verge of collapse. Her muscles screamed, her fingers were numb inside her gloves. But something else drove her forward now. It wasn't just about saving a stranger's life anymore. It was about finding out what secrets he carried. Secrets about the fire that had taken everything from her. She dragged him inside and bolted the door. Through the frosted window she could see them, wolf eyes gleaming like hot coals in the gathering dark. They weren't done with him, and neither, it seemed, was she. For 3 days, Ethan Wolfe was lost in a world of fire and fever. Grace worked tirelessly, cutting away his ruined trousers, cleaning and stitching the terrible wound on his thigh. She packed it with a poultice of yarrow and honey, an old remedy to fight off the poison. She spooned warm broth between his cracked lips and bathed his hot forehead with cool cloths. He tossed and turned, trapped in his delirium, calling out names. "Isabella," he said over and over, his voice breaking on the word. And in his fever dreams he confessed. Not to her, but to the ghosts that haunted him. Fragments of words about betrayal, about fire, about failure. "I should have been there," he repeated, his voice thick with guilt. "The flames, I couldn't reach her." Grace listened. She pieced the broken words together like a dark puzzle. The broken badge told her he was a lawman. The newspaper clipping told her about a forest fire on the border that had claimed several lives. And the photograph, the woman with dark hair and eyes so much like her own, that was the biggest mystery of all. On the evening of the fourth day, the fever finally broke. Grace had fallen asleep in the chair beside his bed, exhaustion finally winning its long battle. She woke up with a start to find him watching her. His eyes were clear for the first time. "You should have left me," he said, his voice a rough whisper. Grace stood up, stretching muscles that had been cramped for days. She poured a cup of water from a pitcher and handed it to him. "Maybe," she said, "but I didn't." A strange moment passed between them, a flicker of recognition, of something shared, though neither of them could have named it. Ethan drank the water, his eyes never leaving her face. "How long?" he asked. "4 days. The storm's passed, but there's 3 feet of snow out there. You're not going anywhere until that leg of yours heals." He tried to sit up, but a sharp lance of pain shot through his leg and he winced. "I need to—" "You need to rest," Grace cut him off, her voice firm. "Unless you want to tear open that wound and bleed to death after all the work I put into keeping you alive." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Yes, ma'am." A sharp knock on the door made them both jump. Grace's face tightened, her hand instinctively moving toward the rifle she kept propped against the wall. "Stay quiet," she whispered. She opened the door to find Samuel Montgomery, the town doctor, stamping snow off his boots on her porch. He was in his 50s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He was one of the few people from Echo Ridge who didn't treat her like an outcast. "Grace," he said, his breath fogging in the cold air. "Brought those medicines you asked for." His eyes slid past her and landed on Ethan. "I see you have company." "Injured traveler," she said, not offering any more. "Wolves got to him." Dr. Montgomery stepped inside, setting his medical bag on the table. "Christian duty to help, of course," he said, but his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Mind if I take a look? Professional curiosity." Grace hesitated, then nodded. She'd known Samuel for years. He'd delivered Lucy. He'd been the one to tell her gently that there was nothing left of her family to bury after the fire. The doctor examined Ethan's wound with practiced hands. "Fine stitching," he commented. "Your poultice is keeping the infection at bay. He's a lucky man." "Will he live?" Ethan asked, his voice dry. Montgomery chuckled. "With Grace's care? Absolutely, though you won't be dancing for a month or two." He packed his bag and then turned to Grace. "A word outside?" On the porch, with the door closed behind them, the doctor's expression turned serious. "You should know, Grace. Hammond's men have been asking questions in town. About strangers." Grace's back went stiff. "What kind of questions?" "The kind of questions that make me think they're looking for someone specific." He glanced back toward the cabin. "Your guest? Do you know who he is?" "He said his name is Ethan Wolfe." Montgomery nodded slowly. Just be careful, Grace. Hammond is more determined than ever to get this land. Having a strange man staying with you, it will give people something to talk about. Let them talk, she said, her voice cold as the winter air. They always do. After the doctor left, Grace stood on the porch, watching his horse disappear into the trees. She had questions for Ethan, questions about the badge, the newspaper, the photograph, but they would have to wait. First, she needed to figure out why Victor Hammond would be so interested in a wounded stranger. When she went back inside, Ethan had managed to prop himself up against the wall, his face pale with the effort. Your doctor friend doesn't trust me, he observed. Samuel doesn't trust many people these days, Grace replied, stoking the fire, and he's not wrong to be cautious. And you? Do you trust me? Grace met his gaze, her eyes steady. I trust that you were half dead when I found you. I trust that wolves don't usually attack an armed man unless he's already wounded. Beyond that, she shrugged, trust is earned in these mountains. Ethan nodded, accepting her answer. Thank you, he said quietly, for saving my life. Not many would have done it. Grace didn't answer right away. Instead, she started preparing their dinner. Rabbit stew simmered in a pot over the fire. The smell filled the small cabin. Outside, the world was dark, and the distant howl of a wolf served as a stark reminder of the dangers that lay just beyond her door. Why were you out there alone? She finally asked. In a storm, no less. Ethan's face closed off, like a book slamming shut. Running from something, he admitted after a long pause, or maybe running toward something. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. It wasn't a real answer, and Grace knew it. But she had her own secrets, her own ghosts. She didn't push. That night, after Ethan had fallen into a fitful sleep on a pallet near the fire, Grace quietly pulled out the items she'd taken from his saddlebag. By the dim light of a candle, she looked at them again. The badge was from the Dakota Territory, a U.S. Marshal. The newspaper article was about a suspicious forest fire that had wiped out a small settlement right in the path of a new railroad expansion. And the photograph. The woman in the picture stared back at her with familiar eyes. On the back, written in faded ink, was a single name, Isabella, 1884. Grace's hands were shaking as she hid the items again, this time under a loose floorboard. Whatever Ethan Wolfe was running from, whatever he was running toward, it was somehow tangled up with her own story. With the fire, with Robert and Lucy. She just couldn't see how. Not yet. Outside, the wolves howled again, closer this time. They were watching. They were waiting. Grace checked her rifle and added another log to the fire. Sleep was not going to come easy tonight. The days melted into weeks. January's brutal cold gave way to the false thaws and sudden blizzards of February. Ethan's leg healed, slowly but surely. At first, he was just a silent, watchful presence in her small cabin. But as he got stronger, he started to help with little things. Whittling kindling, mending tools, teaching her a new kind of knot for her traps. Grace found herself getting used to the quiet company. The cabin felt less empty, with his deep voice breaking the silence now and then. She started listening for his movements, for the sound of him stoking the fire as she made her way home from her trap lines. Home. The word had felt hollow for 3 years. The cabin had been a shelter, a place to exist, not a place to live. But something was changing. Something was thawing, like the ice on the lake in early spring. He never asked about the wedding band she wore on a leather cord around her neck, and she never asked him about the broken badge or the photograph she'd found. They lived in a fragile truce, a space built of unspoken questions. They fell into a rhythm. She would hunt and trap. He would manage the chores at the cabin. They shared meals and told stories that didn't cut too deep, stories of faraway places and different lives. Neither of them spoke about the past. Neither of them spoke about the future. Then came the night that changed it all. Grace had been out late, checking her most distant traps. When she got back, she found Ethan had made dinner. Pan-fried trout, caught from a line he'd set through the ice on the lake. You've been holding out on me, he said, a rare smile on his face. I thought I'd let you discover some things for yourself, she replied, a smile touching her own lips. They ate by the light of the fire. When they were done, Ethan pulled out a small carving knife and a piece of pine he'd been working on for days. I wanted to make something, he said, a little self-conscious. To thank you. His hands, big and calloused, moved with a surprising delicacy. As she watched, a small doll began to take shape. It was crude, but it was recognizable. A simple dress, flowing hair. Grace's breath caught in her throat. It looked just like the charred doll on her mantelpiece. I saw the one you have, he said, his voice uncertain. I thought, maybe you'd like another. If it upsets you, I can stop. Grace couldn't speak. A knot had formed in her chest, tight and painful. She stood up abruptly and walked to the window, staring out at the snow, fighting for control. Her name was Lucy, she said finally, her back still to him. She was 5. The fire, it took her and Robert, my husband. The cabin was silent, except for the crackling of the fire. I was in town, she went on, the words tumbling out now, as if a dam had broken. Selling my herbs. I saw the smoke from miles away. By the time I got back, her voice broke. There was nothing I could do. Nothing but stand there and watch it all burn. She hadn't spoken about that day to anyone. Not a soul. Some nights, she whispered, I can still hear her calling for me, from inside the flames. She heard Ethan put down his carving. She heard his uneven footsteps as he came to stand beside her at the window. He didn't touch her. He just stood there looking out at the night with her. I was a U.S. Marshal, he said quietly. I was investigating suspicious fires. Fires set along the railroad and timber company expansion routes. Grace turned to face him, searching his face in the dim light. Why are you telling me this now? Because you trusted me with your pain, he said, his gray eyes meeting hers. And because I think our ghosts might be connected. Grace's hand went to her throat, to the ring that hung beneath her shirt. The newspaper clipping, she said. The photograph, I found them. He didn't seem surprised. He just nodded slowly. Isabella was my sister, he said. She died in a fire that was almost identical to the one that took your family. A log shifted in the fireplace, sending up a shower of sparks. Neither of them moved. The fires I was investigating, Ethan continued, they all follow a pattern. They happen on land that big companies want. Railroads, timber, mining, small homesteads, family farms. They just go up in smoke, sometimes with the people still inside. A cold dread settled over Grace, a chill that had nothing to do with the winter night. You think the fire that killed my family, you think it wasn't an accident? I think it's possible, he said carefully. What I know is that the Echo Ridge Timber Company has been buying up all the land around this lake, and you're the last one holding out. Hammond, Grace whispered, the name like poison on her tongue. Ethan nodded. Victor Hammond. He has a reputation. Where he goes, progress follows, and people who stand in his way, they tend to have unfortunate accidents. Grace's mind was reeling. All this time she had mourned a tragedy, a senseless, random act of fate, but the idea that it had been deliberate, that Robert and Lucy had been murdered for a piece of land, it ignited a rage inside her, hot and primal. If you're right, she said, her voice shaking, then Hammond murdered my family. It fits the pattern, Ethan confirmed, but proving it is another story. These fires are set by professionals. They don't leave much evidence. And men like Hammond, they're smart. They keep their hands clean. Why didn't you tell me this before? She demanded, the anger flaring up. Because I didn't know if I could trust you, he admitted. And because I didn't have proof, I still don't. Just a pattern, suspicions, and a trail that led me here. To me, Grace said, her voice sharp. You were looking for me. Not exactly, he said, his expression troubled. I was following a rumor, a woman who survived a suspicious fire in this area. I didn't know it was you until I saw that photograph of my sister in your hands. Grace stood up and walked out onto the porch, needing the cold air to clear her head. The frozen lake stretched out before her, a silver mirror in the moonlight. Her family had died for these trees, for this shoreline. The senselessness of it was a physical weight on her chest. Ethan followed her out. I'm sorry, he said. What will you do now? She asked. Keep investigating. Try to find the proof I need to put Hammond away. He glanced at her. His men were asking about me in town. They know I'm getting close. A sudden, chilling realization hit her. The wolves, she said. They didn't find you by accident. A grim smile touched Ethan's lips. I had two-legged pursuers first. I lost them in the forest, but not before they put a bullet in my horse. The wolves were just opportunistic. They stood in silence for a long moment. In the distance, a wolf howled, a lonely sound that echoed across the frozen world. Stay, Grace said, the word surprising even herself. Stay until you're healed. We can work together. We can find the evidence. Ethan looked at her, his face serious in the moonlight. It could be dangerous, Grace. Hammond won't stop. He already took everything that mattered, she said, her hand closing around the ring beneath her shirt. I have nothing left to lose. But as she said it, she knew it wasn't true anymore. In the weeks since she dragged this wounded lawman from the snow, something inside her had started to thaw. Something she had thought was frozen solid forever. As they went back inside, the little carved doll sat on the table where Ethan had left it. Unfinished, but full of a strange new promise. Outside, the wolves were still watching from the darkness of the trees, waiting for a sign of weakness, waiting for the fire to die down. The thaw came early that year. The snow began to retreat, and the ice on the lake thinned at the edges, dark water showing through like a glimpse of a hidden secret. Ethan got stronger every day. He still had a limp, but he moved with a new confidence. They worked together, repairing the winter damage to the cabin, falling into an easy rhythm that didn't require many words. In the evenings, they would pore over his notes, trying to piece together the puzzle of Victor Hammond. Ethan had been tracking the man for 2 years, collecting stories from survivors of other accidents, documenting the relentless expansion of Hammond's timber empire. The problem, Ethan explained one night, is connecting Hammond directly to the fires. He uses men who can't be traced back to him. Men like this one. He pointed to a name that appeared over and over in his notes. Francis Reed. Former soldier, Ethan said, his voice grim. Now he's a hired gun. His specialty is fires that look like accidents. I've been tracking him for months, but he's like a ghost. He had a crude sketch of the man, based on descriptions. Nondescript, forgettable, except for one detail. Unusually pale eyes. And you think he's the one who set the fire here? Grace asked. It fits, Ethan said, but we have no proof. A sharp knock on the door interrupted them. They exchanged a look. Ethan moved into the shadows, his hand on his revolver. It was Dr. Montgomery. His face was tight with worry. Grace, he said, stepping inside, I have news from town. He saw Ethan, no longer a wounded invalid, but a man standing on his own 2 feet. Marshal Wolfe, the doctor said, surprising them both. Word travels. Hammond's men have been asking about a U.S. Marshal investigating fires. What else are they saying? Ethan asked. They're saying, Montgomery said, his voice low, that there's a bounty out, not for your arrest, for information on your whereabouts, for leading them to the man you're hunting. A chill went through Grace. Reed, she whispered. The doctor nodded. Hammond is putting the squeeze on everyone. 3 more families sold out last week. He's making it known that your land is the last piece he needs, and he's spreading rumors that you're harboring a dangerous fugitive. He glanced at Ethan. He's threatening to have you arrested if you don't sign over the deed. Before Grace could even respond, they heard it. The sound of horses approaching, at least 2 of them, moving slowly, deliberately toward the cabin. Ethan was at the window in an instant. 2 riders, he said, his voice tight. One of them looks like Hammond. The other, he froze, his whole body tensing. What is it? Grace asked, reaching for her rifle. The other man, Ethan's voice was flat, devoid of emotion. Light-colored hat, riding a pinto horse. I'd bet my life that's Francis Reed. Dr. Montgomery went pale. There's no back way out, he said, his voice shaking. Then we face them, Grace said, her own voice steady. On my land, on my terms. The 3 of them stepped out onto the porch as the riders came into the clearing. Victor Hammond was an imposing man, tall and broad, with the confident air of someone who always got his way. The other man, the one on the pinto, hung back, his face hidden in the shadows of his hat. "Mrs. Winters," Hammond called out, his voice smooth and cultured. "A pleasure. I see you have company." "State your business, Hammond," Grace said, her rifle held loosely in her hands. "You're trespassing." Hammond swung down from his horse. "I've come with a new offer, Mrs. Winters. $20,000, a generous sum for a woman in your situation. My land is not for sale." "Perhaps you should reconsider," Hammond said, gesturing toward the lake. "Progress is coming to this valley, Mrs. Winters. A railroad spur is coming through, right where your cabin now stands. Your peaceful existence here is coming to an end, one way or another." "Is that a threat?" Grace asked, her finger resting on the trigger of her rifle. "A warning," Hammond corrected smoothly. The second rider finally spoke, his voice surprisingly soft. "It's a beautiful piece of land. It would be a shame if something happened to it." He tilted his head back, and for the first time Grace saw his eyes. They were a pale, washed-out blue, as cold and empty as a winter sky. In that moment, she knew. A certainty settled into her bones, cold and heavy as stone. This was him. This was the man who had burned her home. This was the man who had murdered Robert and Lucy. This was the monster. Before she could speak, Dr. Montgomery stepped forward. "Mr. Hammond," he said, his voice strained, "you must cease these intimidation tactics." Hammond just smiled. "I merely want Mrs. Winters to understand her options." He turned back to Grace. "The offer stands for 1 week. After that, I can't guarantee its generosity." He mounted his horse and tipped his hat in a gesture of mock politeness. As they rode away, Reed turned in his saddle. He looked directly at Grace, and he smiled. A small, knowing smile that sent a sliver of ice through her heart. The three of them stood in silence until the riders were gone. Grace realized she was shaking, not with fear, with a rage so pure it left her breathless. She had been face to face with her family's killer, and she had done nothing. "That was him," she said, her voice hollow. "Grace, you can't know that," Montgomery started to say. "I know," she said. She turned to the doctor, a sudden suspicion dawning in her mind. "What aren't you telling us, Samuel?" The doctor looked away, his face etched with a guilt she'd never seen before. "The night of the fire," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "I was on my way back from delivering a baby. I passed near your property, Grace. It was late." The world seemed to narrow, shrinking down to just the doctor's words. "I saw a rider," he said, his voice trembling, "leaving your land just before I saw the smoke. A man on a pinto horse." "You saw Reed," Ethan stated, his voice flat and hard, "and you said nothing." Montgomery's face crumpled with shame. "The next morning, I found something. Near the road. A leather pouch. It had fire-starting materials inside. Coal oil, phosphorus matches, modified to ignite after a delay." "But you were afraid," Grace finished for him, her voice empty. "Hammond owns this town," Montgomery whispered. "My practice. My family. There were rumors, accidents, disappearances." "So you stayed quiet," Ethan said, his voice laced with contempt, "while she buried empty coffins." "I'm sorry," the doctor choked out. "I've carried this guilt for 3 years." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch. "I kept this. I hope that one day—" He held it out to Ethan. "Maybe this can help bring justice now." Ethan took the pouch, his expression grim. "This is professional work," he confirmed, "designed to give the arsonist an alibi." He looked up at Montgomery. "Will you testify?" The doctor, looking smaller and older than he had just minutes before, nodded. "Yeah," he said. "It's time I found my courage." Grace had moved to the edge of the porch, staring out at the lake. The random tragedy she had mourned for 3 years now had a face, a name, a purpose. Her family had been murdered for this land, and the murderer had just stood on her porch and smiled at her. "What now?" she asked, her voice shaking with a cold, controlled fury. "Now," Ethan said, his own voice hard as steel, "we build a case. Montgomery's testimony and this evidence. It's a start, but we need more." "They'll be back," Grace said. "Hammond won't take no for an answer. And Reed, he enjoys his work too much to just walk away." "We need to be ready for them," Ethan agreed. After the doctor left, a heavy silence settled between them. A storm was brewing on the horizon, a mirror of the one that was about to break over their lives. "You should leave," Grace said suddenly. "Take the evidence. Go. There's nothing keeping you here." Ethan looked at her, his storm-colored eyes searching her face. "Is that what you want?" Grace thought about the empty cabin, the crushing silence that would return if he left. "What I want," she said carefully, "is justice for my family." She paused, then met his gaze, finally admitting the truth to herself. "And I don't want to face this alone." Ethan moved closer, stopping just short of touching her. "Then I'll stay," he said simply. "We'll face it together." As if on cue, a lone wolf howled in the distance, a warning, or maybe a promise. The storm was coming, but for the first time in 3 years, Grace wasn't going to face it alone. The storm broke that night, a furious onslaught of icy rain that hammered against the cabin. Inside, Grace cleaned her rifle with a steady, methodical focus. Ethan paced, a caged wolf, his newly healed leg barely hindering him. "Hammond won't wait a week," Ethan said, breaking the silence. "He saw me. He knows who I am. That changes his timeline." Grace nodded, not looking up from her work. "He'll send Reed back. To scare me, or worse." "How can you be so calm?" Ethan asked, stopping his pacing to look at her. Grace finally looked up, her face cast in shadows by the firelight. "For 3 years, I've lived with ghosts, believing their deaths were a senseless accident. Now I know who did it." She slid the rifle back together with a sharp, decisive click. "There's a clarity in that." Ethan sat down at the table across from her. "We need a plan, a way to prove Hammond ordered Reed to set those fires." "Reed is the key," Grace said. "If we could get him to testify." "Men like Reed don't testify," Ethan said grimly. "They disappear, or they die before they can get to a courtroom. Hammond wouldn't leave a loose end like that." "Then we need to catch Reed in the act," Grace said, a new hard light in her eyes, "with proof that Hammond sent him." "Exactly," Ethan said, "but that means setting a trap, and that puts you right in the middle of it." Their eyes met across the table. He didn't have to say it. She was the bait. "I've been at risk since the day Hammond decided he wanted this land," she said. "At least now I know why." The storm raged outside. A lightning flash lit up the clearing for a brief, stark second. In that flash, Grace saw something. A flicker of movement at the edge of the trees. A shadow. "We're being watched," she said, her voice low. Ethan joined her at the window, careful to stay back from the glass. They stood side by side, shoulders almost touching, the warmth from his body a stark contrast to the cold dread seeping into her bones. "You should sleep," he said after a while. "I'll take first watch." Grace shook her head. "I'm too restless." "You rest. You're still healing." He didn't argue. He just put a hand on her shoulder, a simple grounding touch. "Then we'll both keep watch," he said, "together." The word resonated through her. Together. It had been so long. They sat in the dim light of the fire, rifles across their laps, the storm their only companion. The rain finally softened, the wind died down. In the quiet, an owl called from the darkness. "Tell me about her," Ethan said suddenly. "Your daughter." Grace was surprised. No one ever asked about Lucy. "She was wild," Grace said, a small smile touching her lips. "Fearless. She climbed trees higher than her father thought was safe. She said she was collecting the world's treasures." The familiar ache was in her chest, but for the first time, it was mixed with a bittersweet warmth, not just pain. After a moment, Ethan spoke, his voice low. "Isabella, my sister, she was going to be a teacher. She believed books could build a civilization faster than railroads." He stared into the dying embers. "I've been chasing ghosts for 3 years, Grace, looking for patterns, trying to give her death some meaning." "Have you found it?" she asked. "Not meaning," he said. "Purpose. If I can stop Hammond, if I can stop other families from suffering, maybe that's as close as a man like me gets." A sharp crack from outside snapped them both to attention. It wasn't thunder. It was the unmistakable sound of a branch breaking under a heavy weight. "Human or animal?" Ethan whispered, his rifle already up. "Too deliberate for an animal," Grace whispered back. They waited, every nerve on edge. Then another sound, the soft nicker of a horse being quieted, somewhere behind the woodshed. Grace caught Ethan's eye. She gestured toward the floor. "There's a trap door," she breathed, her voice barely audible. "A root cellar. It has a tunnel. Leads out behind the property. You can circle around. I'll keep them busy here." He didn't like it. She could see it in his eyes, but he knew it was the only way. He gave her a sharp nod, lifted the rug, and disappeared into the darkness below. Now she was alone. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, but her hands were steady on her rifle. Whoever was out there, they were about to find out that the widow Winters was not an easy target. Time stretched, thin and tight. Grace waited in the shadows, every sound magnified. The creak of the cabin settling, the scuttling of a mouse in the walls. Then a sharp whistle pierced the night. 3 short blasts. The all-clear signal they had agreed on. She didn't lower her rifle. It could be a trick. She waited, counting to 60 in her head. The door creaked open. Ethan stepped inside, alone. His face was grim. "It was one of Hammond's men," he said, his voice low. "A foreman named Jenkins. He was watching the cabin." "Just watching?" Grace asked. "For now," Ethan said. She saw a smear of blood on his knuckles. "I persuaded him to deliver a message to Hammond." A tight, cold smile crossed his face. "A convincing kind of persuasion. I told him the widow Winters has protection now." The words settled around her like a warm cloak. Protection. She hadn't had that in a long time. "Hammond will come," she said, a new certainty in her voice. "His pride won't let him back down." "Good," Ethan said, bolting the door. "That's what we want. Hammond in the open." Dawn broke, pale and gray. They had dozed in shifts, but neither had truly slept. As Grace stoked the fire, she saw him, a lone rider coming from the direction of town. Dr. Montgomery. He looked haggard, like he'd ridden all night. "Hammond knows," he said, stumbling onto the porch. "Jenkins came back to town last night, beaten half to death. He went straight to Hammond. They're planning something. Today." Grace exchanged a look with Ethan. Their provocation had worked. Maybe too well. "There's more," the doctor said, his hand shaking. "I telegraphed the territorial marshals like you asked. They're sending deputies, but they won't be here for at least 3 days." 3 days. It was a death sentence. They were on their own. "We need allies," Ethan said, after the doctor had given them a hurried breakfast of cornbread. "People in town who Hammond has wronged." "The Wilsons," Grace suggested immediately. "They run the general store. Jacob was a sharp shooter in the war. They've always been kind to me." "The Hendersons," Montgomery added. "Their son was crippled in Hammond's mill. The company refused to pay a dime." A plan began to form. Montgomery would return to town and quietly rally support. Ethan would fortify the cabin. And Grace. Grace would once again be the bait. "I don't like it," Ethan said after the doctor had gone. "Leaving you here alone." "I won't be alone for long," Grace replied, checking the ammunition in her revolver. "If Hammond follows his pattern, he'll send Reed first. We need to be ready for him." They spent the morning preparing for a war, boarding windows, creating firing positions. Grace showed Ethan the hidden places on her property. A small cave near the lake, the root cellar tunnel, a hollow tree. By midday, they were as ready as they would ever be. A charged silence hung between them. "If this goes wrong," Grace began, "I want you to know." Ethan reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "It won't go wrong," he said. "But I know. Finding you in that snowstorm, maybe the wolves did me a favor." The sound they had both been dreading cut through the air. The thunder of hoofbeats, multiple riders coming in fast. Ethan was at the window. "5 of them," he said, his voice grim. "Hammond, Reed, and 3 others I don't recognize, hired guns." Their careful plans had just gone up in smoke. They were out of time. They were outnumbered, and they were on their own. A strange calm settled over Grace. After 3 years of living in a gray haze of grief, the prospect of a final, violent confrontation felt like a release. "Let them come," she said. They took their positions. Grace visible through the front window, a lone woman in a remote cabin. Ethan, hidden in the shadows, a ghost with a gun. Mrs. Winters! Hammond's voice boomed across the clearing. I believe we have business to conclude. Grace stepped out onto the porch, her rifle held casually in her hands. I told you, Hammond, my land is not for sale. Hammond just smiled, a cold, empty expression. The situation has changed, he said. Your guest assaulted one of my employees. As he spoke, Grace saw Reed, on the pinto horse, begin to edge to the left, circling around the side of the cabin. A flanking maneuver. I'm not alone, Grace said, her voice ringing out in the clear, cold air. And I know what you did, Hammond. What you ordered Reed to do to my family. Hammond's smile faltered. Reed, however, just continued his slow, deliberate circle, his pale eyes fixed on her. It's not slander if it's true, Grace pressed on, her voice rising. Dr. Montgomery saw Reed leaving my property the night of the fire. He found the incendiary devices Reed used. This hit home. Hammond's composure cracked. He shot a nervous glance at Reed. That was all the confirmation Grace needed. He had ordered it. He had knowingly murdered her husband and her child. I've considered everything very carefully, Grace said, taking a step back toward the cabin door, including what's about to happen here. What's about to happen? Hammond snarled, his mask of civility gone. Is that you're going to sign this deed, or we're going to have another tragic accident. Cabin fires are so common out here. The casual cruelty of it stole her breath. The past isn't dead, Grace said, her hand tightening on her rifle. It's not even past. With that, she stepped back inside the cabin and slammed the door. She moved to the barricade they'd made from the overturned table. Ethan was hidden in the alcove, waiting. The side door creaked open. Reed slipped inside, silent as a snake. He held a revolver in one hand and a small leather pouch in the other. The same kind of pouch Montgomery had found. He saw her behind the table. His lips curled into that terrible, soulless smile. All alone after all, Mrs. Winters. Your Marshall friend must have decided you weren't worth dying for. Who says I'm alone? Grace said, her rifle trained on his chest. Just you and me, he said, his voice a soft caress. Like it should have been 3 years ago. You murdered my family, she stated, her voice flat. He shrugged. Business is business, nothing personal. He looked around the cabin. Nice place. Shame about what's going to happen to it. You're going to have a little accident with your cooking fire. So tragic. His pale eyes gleamed. Hammond wants it to look like an accident. But between you and me, I'm hoping you'll be difficult. It's been a while since I've had any real fun. The casual sadism of it chilled her to the bone. There's just one problem with your plan, she said, her voice shaking with controlled rage. And what's that? You're the one who's not walking out of this cabin alive. On her words, Ethan stepped out of the shadows, his revolver aimed squarely at Reed's head. Drop it, Reed. You're under arrest. For a split second, surprise registered on Reed's face, the first real emotion she'd ever seen there. Then it was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating assessment of his odds. Marshal Wolf, he said, not lowering his weapon, thought you'd still be licking your wounds. Drop the gun, Reed, Ethan said, his voice like ice. Or I'll drop you. Reed's expression shifted into something predatory. Here's the problem, Marshal. You need me alive to testify against Hammond. His revolver shifted slightly, aiming now at Grace. I just need Mrs. Winters dead. Hammond wins either way. The cabin was a tinderbox of tension, waiting for a spark. You're not as smart as you think, Ethan said. We have evidence. Dr. Montgomery saw you. The word of a country doctor? Reed sneered. Maybe not, Grace cut in, but you'll still hang for the attempted murder of a U.S. Marshal. Hammond will cut you loose to save himself. He was considering it. She could see it in his eyes. He was reassessing. Before he could decide, the front door burst open. One of Hammond's hired guns stood there, revolver drawn. Boss wants to know what's taking so... He froze. That one moment of distraction was all Reed needed. He fired at Grace. The bullet splintered the table inches from her head. Ethan fired back instantly, hitting Reed in the shoulder. Chaos erupted. The hired gun in the doorway started shooting wildly. Grace fired back, driving him out onto the porch. Reed, wounded but still fighting, scrambled for cover, returning fire. Outside, Hammond was shouting orders. They were surrounded, trapped, outgunned. "The root cellar!" Ethan yelled over the gunfire. "Go, I'll cover you!" "Together!" she yelled back. He met her eyes across the room, a silent agreement passing between them. He laid down a volley of covering fire as she sprinted to the center of the room and yanked open the trap door. He backed toward her, still firing, as she scrambled down the ladder into the darkness. He followed right behind her, pulling the heavy door shut just as bullets thudded into the floor above them. They were in the pitch black, the smell of damp earth all around them. Grace lit a lantern. A narrow tunnel led away from the cabin. "It comes out behind the woodshed," she whispered. They crawled through the cramped space, the muffled sounds of Hammond's men tearing the cabin apart above them. They emerged into a small chamber under the woodshed. "We need a plan," Ethan said, his face grim in the lantern light. Blood was soaking through his shirt sleeve where a bullet had grazed him. "The cave by the lake," Grace suggested. "No," he said, his mind working fast. "They'll find us. We need to separate them. Reed is wounded. Hammond will send him back to town with one of the hired guns. That leaves Hammond and two others. Better odds." "The path to town passes the Wilson homestead," Grace said, catching on. "If we could get word to Jacob." "Exactly," Ethan said. "But first we need to get to your horse." The sturdy pony was in a small corral behind the woodshed. "I'll go," Grace said. "They're less likely to shoot a woman on sight." "Absolutely not," Ethan argued, but she cut him off. "I know these woods better than you, and you're wounded." He reluctantly agreed. "2 minutes. If you're not back, I'm coming after you." Grace slipped out of the trapdoor, staying low. She could see Hammond on her porch yelling at his men. Reed and the third gunman were gone, just as Ethan predicted. She took a deep breath and bolted from the cover of the woodshed, running for the trees where the corral was hidden. A shout went up. She'd been spotted. Gunfire erupted. Bullets kicked up snow at her heels. She ran faster, diving into the cover of the pines just as a bullet splintered the bark where her head had been. She vaulted the fence, grabbed the bridle, and threw herself onto the pony's back. No time for a saddle. A gunman appeared at the edge of the trees, raising his rifle. She kicked the pony into a gallop just as he fired, the bullet whistling past her. She raced back toward the woodshed. Ethan was already out of the trap door, his revolver blazing, providing covering fire. He swung up behind her on the pony in one fluid motion. "Go!" he yelled, firing one last shot at their pursuers. Grace urged the pony into the dense forest, onto a narrow game trail where horses couldn't easily follow. Behind them, Hammond's enraged voice echoed through the trees. But they were already swallowed by the wilderness. They were alive. They had escaped. But they had lost everything, and the fight was far from over. They rode hard for an hour, pushing deeper into the mountains. When the pony started to tire, Grace found a small clearing by a stream where they could rest. Now that the adrenaline was fading, she could see how bad Ethan's wounds were. The graze on his arm was bleeding freely, and his face was pale. "Let me see that," she insisted, cleaning the wound with water from the stream and binding it with a strip of her petticoat. "Back there," Ethan said, his voice rough with emotion. "When Reed had that gun on you?" He shook his head, unable to finish the sentence. But Grace understood. In that moment of life and death, something had solidified between them, a realization of what they stood to lose. "We survived," she said softly, "and we know the truth." Hammond ordered the fire. Reed carried it out. "And they'll both pay," Ethan said, his voice like iron. "I promise you that." They found an old abandoned hunter's cabin as dusk fell, a simple one-room shelter deep in the woods. Grace had left a small cache of supplies there years ago. By nightfall, they had a fire going and a meager meal of jerky and dried apples. "What now?" Grace asked, staring into the flames. "Hammond will have men watching the roads," Ethan said. "Our best chance is to circle around to the Wilson homestead. If Montgomery got our message to them, they might be able to help. And if not, then we keep moving," he said, his jaw set. "I won't stop until Hammond is brought to justice. For your family, for Isabella, for all of them." The sincerity in his voice warmed a part of her that had been cold for 3 years. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for believing me, for helping me find the truth, for making me feel like more than just a ghost." "I know something about ghosts," he said. "I was one too, until a snowstorm and a pack of wolves led me to you." He reached out and took her hand. They had both been half alive, haunting the edges of their own lives. And somehow, against all odds, they had found in each other a reason to come back. "Whatever happens," he said, his voice soft, "we face it together." "Together," she agreed. And in that one word, there was a promise, a bridge between the ashes of the past and the uncertainty of the future. Outside, a wolf howled, a reminder of the wildness and the danger that surrounded them. But for the first time in a long, long time, Grace did not feel alone in the dark. Dawn broke, and a fresh dusting of snow had covered their tracks. It was a small blessing, a temporary reprieve. As they rode double on the pony, descending from the mountains, the forest began to thin. They were on a wide logging road when they saw them. Two riders coming their way, Hammond's men. Grace reacted instantly, pulling the pony off the road and into the dense cover of the trees. They dismounted, Ethan taking up a position to watch the road. "They haven't seen us," he whispered, "but they're stopping. They found our tracks." The riders turned their horses onto the trail, following their hoof prints in the new snow. "There's a creek nearby," Grace whispered back. "Water won't hold tracks." They moved as silently as they could through the forest. The cold air burned in Grace's lungs. The sound of running water was a welcome relief. They led the pony across the slippery stones of the creek and then waded downstream through the frigid water. They had gone nearly half a mile when Ethan stumbled, his face pale, his hand pressed against his side. "We have to rest," Grace insisted. "No time," he gritted out. "They're too close." "You'll be no use to anyone if you collapse," she said, guiding him to a small overhang on the creek bank. She pulled back his coat. The wound on his arm had reopened, but it was the graze on his ribs that worried her. It was angry and red. Infection was setting in. "You should have told me," she said, her voice tight with worry. "Had other things on my mind," he managed to say. The Wilsons' farm was closer than town. "We'll go there," she decided. "Martha Wilson knows something of medicine." She helped him back onto the pony, and this time she walked, leading the animal. His condition was getting worse. His breathing was shallow, his skin hot to the touch. As they crested a small rise, she saw it, a plume of smoke rising from the chimney of the Wilsons' farmhouse. They were almost there. "Hammond's men might be watching," Ethan murmured, his consciousness fading. "We'll come in from the back," she assured him, "through the orchard." As they neared the edge of the trees, a gruff voice called out, "Who's there? Show yourself." "Jacob," Grace called back. "It's Grace Winters." The figure of Jacob Wilson emerged from behind an apple tree, a shotgun in his hands. He was a barrel-chested man in his 60s, with a full white beard. "Grace, Lord above, we thought you might be dead. Hammond's men have been saying you had a shootout at your cabin and disappeared." "Not far from the truth," Grace said. "This is Marshal Ethan Wolfe. He's wounded. He needs help." "Montgomery came by yesterday," Jacob said, helping her support Ethan. "Told us you might be in trouble. Told us to keep an eye out for you." Relief washed over Grace. "Did he leave the evidence?" "Hidden safe in our root cellar," Jacob confirmed. Martha Wilson, a practical, no-nonsense woman, took one look at Ethan and sprang into action. Within minutes, he was in a warm bed, and she was cleaning his wounds. "Infection's setting in," she said, her expression grim. "He'll need to stay put for a few days." Days they didn't have. "Hammond's put a price on our heads," Jacob told them. $500, alive or dead." "We've put you in danger," Grace said, her heart sinking. "Nonsense," Martha said, not looking up from her work. "Hammond's had it coming for years. It's about time someone stood up to him." "Montgomery told us everything," Jacob added, his eyes kind but resolute. "About the fires, about what really happened to Robert and Lucy. I fought in a war to stop one kind of evil. I won't stand by and let another kind destroy this town." A sharp knock came at the front door. Jacob grabbed his shotgun. Grace drew her revolver. It was Dr. Montgomery, and with him was a young man in a deputy's uniform. Deputy Collins. "Grace," Montgomery said, relief flooding his face. "Thank God you made it." He went immediately to help Martha with Ethan. Deputy Collins stood stiffly, his eyes assessing Grace. "Mrs. Winters," he said, his voice formal, "I need to know exactly what happened at your cabin." "Hammond and his man Reed came to force me to sell my land," she said, her voice steady. "When I refused, Reed tried to kill me, just like he killed my husband and daughter 3 years ago, on Hammond's orders." A flicker of something crossed the young deputy's face. "My brother," he said, his voice tight, "died in a logging accident at Hammond's camp last year. The sheriff did nothing. I've been waiting for a chance to prove what Hammond really is." "This is that chance," Jacob said, "but we have to move fast." "Hammond has gathered 20 men at the mill," Collins said, his expression grim. "Loggers, hired guns. They're planning something. Tonight. Word is Reed is pushing them to burn out anyone who stands in their way. Starting with this farm." The familiar cold dread washed over Grace. Fire. Again. But this time, she wouldn't be watching from a distance. This time she would stand against the flames. "Then we prepare," Jacob said. "No." Grace shook her head. "We draw them away. We face them on my terms. At my cabin, where it all began." "You're going to use yourself as bait," Collins realized. "It's the only way," she insisted. Dr. Montgomery came out of the bedroom. "He'll live," he said of Ethan, "but he can't be moved." Grace had known it, but the words still hit her like a physical blow. She would have to face them without him. She went in to see him. He was awake, his face pale against the pillows. "Hammond's coming," he said, his voice weak. He tried to sit up. "Help me up." Grace gently pushed him back down. "You're not coming," she said. "You're too weak. Grace, you can't face them alone." "I won't be," she said. "Collins is with us. The Wilsons. Others from town. This isn't just my fight anymore." She took his hand. "Promise me something," he said, his voice intense. "Don't make this about revenge. Justice, yes. But revenge, it consumes everything." She looked at him, at the man who had shown her that it was possible to live again, not just exist. "I promise," she said. "When this is over," he began, then hesitated. "When this is over, I'd like to stay, if you'll have me." The words hung in the air, a quiet, simple promise of a future she had never dared to imagine. "I'd like that," she whispered. His tired smile transformed his face. "Then come back to me," he said. "Whatever happens tonight, come back." "I will," she promised. And it was a reason to survive, a future to fight for, not just a past to avenge. As darkness fell, a small force of a dozen people, Grace, Deputy Collins, Jacob Wilson, and 9 others who had their own scores to settle with Hammond, rode silently through the winter night. They arrived at Grace's burned-out clearing and took up positions, hidden in the trees, in the root cellar, behind the woodshed. Grace stood alone on the porch of her half-destroyed cabin, a single lantern at her feet, illuminating her. She was the bait. The waiting was the hardest part. The cold seeped into her bones. Doubt began to creep in. Then she heard them, the sound of hoofbeats, a dozen riders, maybe more, emerging from the darkness. Hammond at the front, Reed beside him. The moment of reckoning had arrived. Grace listened from inside the ruined cabin as Hammond gave his orders. "Surround the place. $500 to the man who brings her to me alive. I want her to sign those papers before she dies." "And if she resists?" Reed's soft voice asked. "Then do what you do best," Hammond snarled. "But make sure the cabin burns to the ground this time. No evidence left." It was a confession, witnessed by a dozen hidden men. All that was left was to spring the trap. Grace stepped into the doorway, silhouetted by the lantern. "Hammond!" she called out. "I'm here. Let's talk." Hammond halted his men, surprised. "Mrs. Winters, how convenient. I was just coming to make you a final offer." "At gunpoint?" she countered. "The territorial marshals will find this very interesting when they arrive tomorrow," she said, bluffing. "Dr. Montgomery saw Reed leave my property the night of the fire. He has the evidence." Hammond's composure shattered. He turned to Reed. I don't care what it takes. Kill her now. Burn everything. It was the final piece they needed, a direct order to commit murder. But before Grace could give the signal, Reed moved. Faster than she could have imagined, he drew his revolver and fired. The bullet slammed into the doorframe next to her head as she dove back inside, and then all hell broke loose. "Drop your weapons!" Colin's voice boomed from the darkness. Gunfire erupted from all sides. Hammond's men, caught completely by surprise, were thrown into chaos. Grace scrambled to the window. Hammond was trying to flee, wheeling his horse around. She burst out of the cabin, raising her rifle. Her first shot missed. Her second hit his horse. The animal reared, throwing Hammond to the ground. The gunfight was short and brutal. Two of Hammond's men were down. The rest quickly surrendered. Collins moved in to arrest the stunned and furious Hammond. "It's over," Grace said, her own gun trained on the fallen tyrant. "Where's Reed?" she asked, scanning the clearing. Collins's face darkened. He slipped away in the confusion. He knows these woods. A cold dread filled Grace. Reed was still out there, wounded, cornered, and more dangerous than ever. "He'll head for the lake," she said with a sudden certainty. "The ice." "Go," Collins said. "We'll handle this. Be careful, Grace. He kills because he enjoys it." She didn't need the warning. She grabbed her rifle and plunged into the darkness, following the tracks in the snow. The trail led directly to the frozen lake. She could see his footprints leading out onto the vast moonlit expanse of ice. She hesitated. The ice was treacherous. But then a bullet shattered the ice at her feet. "Quite the persistent widow, aren't you?" Reed's voice echoed across the frozen lake. He was 100 yards out, using a ridge of ice for cover. "It's over, Reed!" she yelled back. "There's nowhere left to run." His laugh was a chilling, eerie sound. "There's always somewhere to run, Mrs. Winters." Another shot, closer this time. Grace started moving out onto the ice, her rifle ready. The ice groaned under her feet. "Why my family?" she called out, keeping him talking, pinpointing his position. "Nothing personal," his voice drifted back. "Hammond wanted the land, no survivors. I just follow instructions." He had moved, circling to her right. She adjusted her course, her eyes scanning the darkness. The ice was cracking beneath her, small fissures spreading out like a spider's web. "Did you enjoy it?" she asked, her voice hard as the ice itself. "Watching them burn?" "Enjoyment implies passion, Mrs. Winters." His voice was very close now. "I have none. Only professional pride." She saw him, a dark silhouette against a ridge of ice, not 20 yards away. She raised her rifle. "For Robert and Lucy," she whispered. But before she could fire, a loud crack split the night. Not a gunshot. The sound of ice giving way. A huge section of the lake between them collapsed. Reed scrambled back, but the fracture spread, chasing him. He fired one last wild shot in her direction as the ice gave way completely beneath him. His scream was cut short as he plunged into the black, frigid water. Grace stood frozen, rifle raised, waiting. But he never resurfaced. The broken ice settled, leaving a dark, gaping wound in the lake's surface. Francis Reed was gone, claimed by the very wilderness he had tried to conquer. There was no satisfaction, no sense of victory, just a hollow, empty relief. She turned and walked back to the shore, back toward the light of the torches in the clearing, back toward the promise of a future. As she walked, the first snowflakes of a new storm began to fall, soft and silent, covering the blood and the violence in a blanket of pure, clean white. Spring came, washing away the last of the winter snow and the darkness that had haunted Echo Ridge for so long. Grace stood on the porch of her rebuilt cabin, watching the mist rise off the lake. The cabin was larger now, with a proper bedroom and a workshop filled with the scent of fresh-cut pine. Victor Hammond was in a territorial prison, his timber empire dismantled. The town, once poisoned by his greed and fear, was slowly healing. Deputy Collins was the new sheriff, and under his leadership, the land and businesses seized from Hammond were returned to the people he had wronged. The town that had once called Grace a witch now treated her with a quiet respect. They saw her not as an outcast, but as the woman who had stood up to a tyrant and won. She found herself part of a community again, a web of friendships forged in the fire of their shared struggle. The Wilsons, Dr. Montgomery, Sheriff Collins, they were her family now. "Penny for your thoughts," a voice said beside her. Ethan. He had healed, the harsh lines of pain on his face replaced by a quiet contentment. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, the gesture as natural as breathing. "Just thinking how much has changed," she said. "A year ago, I was just existing. Now, now I'm living again." "No regrets?" he asked. She knew what he was asking, about building a new life on the ashes of her old one, about the silver wedding band that now sat on her finger. "None," she said. "Robert and Lucy will always be a part of me, but I've found room in my heart for new beginnings." As if on cue, Jacob Wilson appeared at the edge of the clearing, leading a small boy by the hand. Michael. An orphan, his parents taken by the winter flu. The Wilsons had taken him in, but they were too old to raise a child, so Grace and Ethan had offered him a home. Grace knelt down to the boy's level. "Hello, Michael," she said, her voice soft. "Welcome home." That evening, Grace walked down to the lake's edge alone. She took the old wedding ring, Robert's ring, from the leather cord around her neck. For a moment she held it, feeling the familiar weight of her grief. But it was different now. It was a memory, not a ghost. With a whispered goodbye filled with gratitude, not sorrow, she buried the ring at the base of a young pine tree. Not hidden but planted, a seed of the past from which the future could grow. She turned back toward the cabin. Its windows glowed with warm light. Inside, Ethan and Michael were waiting. A new family forged not from blood, but from choice, from second chances. From the quiet understanding that even after the deepest, darkest winter, spring will always come. If you enjoyed this story of survival and justice, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales from the edge of the map.